Dublin, 1916. From this very viewpoint, men gazed out the window at a city at war. Men and women who had given their lives to free Ireland. A story that became internationally renowned, played out like theatre as a dying man's love for a woman. From Monday the 24th of April 1916, the only sound in the city was of bullets and bombs and mayhem. But on Saturday the 29th, all that was left was silence. However, in the background, another war was being fought on the streets of Dublin. Thousands died, mowed down by starvation, sickness and poverty. Or as it has been said, the death rate in working class Dublin was higher than that of those in Calcutta.
The 1798 rebellion ended in failure. Nevertheless, it made the British cabinet aware of the Irish question. William Pitt had already conceived the idea of abolishing the Irish Parliament completely, uniting it with the British Parliament in what would be termed the Union. Lord Cornwallis had also been sent to Ireland as Lord Lieutenant and Commander-in-Chief of the Army, with a dual purpose in mind: to quell the rebellion and to pave the way for the proposed Act of Union.
The Act of Union in 1801 was one of the main catalysts that would alter the nation's history.
Prior to the Act of Union, in 1757 you had the White Street Commission. The White Street Commission was there to drag Dublin out of the medieval times. And Dublin, over the next couple of decades, became a very flamboyant city. Then the Act of Union took place in 1801. What that simply meant was that the Parliament was now abandoned Dublin, and that when that took place, all the Georgian buildings were left abandoned also because the gentry fled.
Under the Act of Union, Ireland lost the power to govern itself.
The Irish famine was the greatest European disaster of the 19th century.
The severity of the famine was widely felt across the west of Ireland. However, in September of 1845, it arrived in Waterford.
The 1841 census showed there were over 8 million people living in Ireland.
On the 28th of March 1839, the Dungarvan Workhouse was declared. The construction was issued in December of the same year. Reverend James Alcock, a Church of Ireland minister, was a great relief to the people of Waterford. He died on the 23rd of March 1893. An inscription on his grave sums his life up perfectly, describing him as a faithful vicar, a generous friend, a counsellor to the sick and distressed of all classes and creed, a humble Christian respected and lamented by a large circle. However, by the autumn of 1846, the number of destitute households in Waterford were given up to nearly 50% of the population.
By 1881, this figure had fallen by over 3 million.
The Kinsale Workhouse in Cork was built to accommodate 500 inmates. In July of 1849, the record showed that there was then over 2,000, and nearly 100 new arrivals came within that week. Reverend Rogers' published letter sums it up. I can show the living skeletons crouching and trembling together in one corner of their dark and cheerless chambers, while at the other lies a corpse of a father or brother from the effects of the hunger. The parish priest and the reverend of the Church of Ireland together carry the bodies to the churchyard. Today, there is a famine walk which concludes with a tree to remember the famine victims of the Kinsale Workhouse.
In the winter of 1845, the clothing the children wore was not suitable to protect them from the elements. Most were handmade, hand-stitched, repurposed clothing. Many children were barefoot and had just the clothes on their backs. Clothes were often handed down, or garments were made from all manner of off-cut textiles. In 1850, in an effort to offer some relief to the famine survivors of Limerick City and to take advantage of the newly invented sewing machine, Peter Tate opened Peter Tate's Factory, the first ready-made clothing factory in the world. In doing so, Tate changed the clothing industry forever. Previous to this, items of clothing for the upper classes were produced from start to finish by skilled tailors and dressmakers. During his 30 years, Peter Tate was to show remarkable business and entrepreneurial genius. He is still known today as Limerick's leading industrialist and was mayor himself from 1866 to 1868. Peter Tate emigrated from Scotland to Ireland in 1838. He arrived in the city with 7 shillings and sixpence in his pocket to join his sister, who had married Martin Honan, future mayor of Limerick City.
In our modern world, as we travel along the beautiful coast of Ireland, along the fabulous beaches of Donegal, all the way down to the glorious city of Galway, and into Cork, and down into the breathtaking sights of Kerry, it's hard to imagine that this devastation had hit our country, and it spread. And it's in Mayo, there's a similar walk as there is in Cork, in remembrance to the victims of the famine. Those who had money left this island and they travelled to the ships, the coffin ships that sailed from Cork all the way to New York, into the 5 points of New York, some to South Boston and Canada, even far-reaching as far as San Francisco. Others made their way to Liverpool or into Whitechapel in London. But the poorest of the poorest made their way to Dublin. The second city of the British Empire, this flamboyant city, had now become the city with the worst slums in Europe. The first catalyst was the Act of Union that prepared the city for the people. The second was the famine, as it prepared the people for the land.
Grange Gorman Women's Prison had already opened in 1836. It was the first ever exclusively female penitentiary in the British Isles. Prisoners were strictly segregated so that those awaiting trial or serving sentences for minor crimes were not corrupted by those convicted for major crimes or who had been convicted multiple times. For the year 1855, there were 7,394 Roman Catholic inmates, 719 Protestant inmates, and a mere 6 Presbyterian inmates confined in Grange Gorman Penitentiary. In 1848, on the day of the Inspector General's visit, 96 adults and 21 children were committed to Grange Gorman Penitentiary. The Adults General had already declared that the only way of reducing crime in the city of Dublin was for citizens to care for the destitute juveniles wandering the streets. During the famine, orphaned or abandoned juveniles travelled to Dublin in the hope of getting into the workhouse or a fever hospital. Many were vagrants and resorted to crime for survival. Between 1844 and 1848, there was a total 23,833 boys jailed under the age of 16. Dublin was a mass of contradictions.
Dublin was indeed a city of many contradictions. On the south side, you had a neighbourhood known as the Four Corners of Hell, while on the north side, you had a street called Hell Street, names derived from street crime and brawling. Rats was another problem. By testimony, people would look out the window at night and believe the street was moving. It wasn't, it was the rats. They would also follow the pregnant women for milk. Men have woken at night and seen the rat sucking on the breast of his wife while he'd shake it away, and the new child born would be dead within 3 days. Consumption, or as we know it today, TB, was also rampant. It didn't only take the lives of individuals, but it took the lives of entire families.
The second city of the British Empire, a city of nationalist Ireland with class divisions that were extraordinary. This was diversity, complexities, the rich and poor, immigrant and native. It had nationalist, unionist, Catholic, Protestant, Jew and Quaker. A mix of people bound in a city that was in part more impoverished than Dickens's Whitechapel. The Monto. The name is derived from Montgomery Street, now called Foley Street, which runs parallel to the lower end of Talbot Street towards what is now Conley Station. It was immortalised as Night Town in the Circe chapter of James Joyce's famous work Ulysses, where the central protagonists Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus together visit a brothel. From the 1860s to the 1920s, there were anything up to 1,600 prostitutes working the Monto. Its financial viability was aided by the number of British Army barracks. Monto was also a hive of IRA activity, particularly around the time of the War of Independence, with several safe houses for the flying columns, which included Phil Shanahan's public house.
As I walk along this street, I begin to imagine what it was like for the women who worked here. For anywhere between 1800 and 1923, this was known as the Monto, the most infamous street of Europe amidst the worst slums in Europe. Country girls had come here, innocent women with great expectations of finding a chap and starting a family and maybe finding a job in a shop. But as they emerged from that train, they were met with men, callous men, who brought them over, not to a shop, but to a flash house run by a madam. And before they knew where they were working the Monto. Between the 1800s and 1923, it was estimated that 1,600 women worked the Monto. Women the inner city people refer to as the poor unfortunates. The poor unfortunates, because that's exactly what they were. They weren't hardened criminals, they were just simply innocent women that had found themselves at the wretched hands of not Dickens' Fagin, but Dublin's madams. Hardened women who not only ran the brothels, or the kip houses as they were called, but the speakeasies. They sent manhole crawlers down into the manholes to take up the drink they'd hidden there to sell at massive prices after the pubs had closed. They had one thing on their mind, and that was money. And as soon as the beauty fled from these women, or their bodies was broken and wretched from being misused, from every sailor that docked its boat within Dublin's port, they were cast out. Or maybe they found themselves pregnant and gave birth to what was known as the Monto babies. The Monto baby being born on the streets of Dublin, maybe beside the Hewers Bully near the man trap where they were led. Down beside the manhole crawlers, the bread and tea boxers, the snow falling, children with bare feet. Nobody wore shoes, starvation, anger and brawling amidst the animal gang in a neighbourhood that was hidden behind De Valera's image of Ireland and of Dublin. A Dublin and an Ireland that he wanted was the colleen dancing at the crossroads. When the madams would go up along O'Connell Street, they'd put the beautiful ladies in the carts, they'd wave to the men, hoping to entice them down. A public outcry came, and the government simply answered it by saying, "Send them back down to the Monto. Send them back down to the Monto." The Dublin of the 1900s, a Dublin that was hidden behind 1916 and the Civil War, and a government that didn't want to tell us about the working class plight between consumption, between a rat-infested place, between poverty and crime. You had these innocent women being used by every single sailor that stepped off the boat within the port of Dublin, because it became infamous throughout Europe as Dublin had the biggest brothel in Europe. So how did it end? This horrific story that went on within Dublin. Well, a man by the name of Frank Duff. As the story goes, or one I heard, he found a woman dying, a prostitute. So he went down to the Monto. He'd been down there before, and he had an answer. And the answer was, he got a cross, and he gathered a lot of people with him, and he rang a lot of people the evening before. Judges and solicitors and all sorts of men of authority ran out of the Monto when they knew he was coming with the cross. And he marched upon the Monto, the biggest brothel in Europe, and he found the highest point he could, and he nailed upon that wall a cross. And he sent photographs or images of the face of Jesus onto the doors of every brothel within the neighbourhood, and the Monto died. The cross, the image of the cross, or the representation of the cross, destroyed the biggest brothel in Europe, simply led by a layman who had a heart of faith, who lived with a moral code that what was going on was unjust and he was going to do something about it. Maybe in our society today, as we have technically advanced, but how morally we have decayed, wretchedly. Maybe God will look from heaven and send someone like Frank Duff, who again carry that cross into our world to bring again unity and strength among people and refresh them with a simple joy of waking up and living in a world of peace. The Monto story is over. A new story has begun. We now live in a city that accepts blood on the streets. May God send a new Frank Duff with the same message of the cross.